We have a distinguished panel here. This last session is best practices and lessons learned on doing business in Europe. And so we are grateful to our panelists, and I'm going to give you a few biographical remarks on each one. And then I ask you to refer to your program for further biographical information. To my immediate left is David Russell. He's an attorney at law and chairman of the Indiana District Export Council. David Williams Russell concentrates in his practice in the area of complex international and domestic business transactions, sophisticated corporate litigation and dispute resolution matters, and arbitration. His full bio is in the panel, and please see that for more details. He is a great friend to business in Indiana. Next up, next to him is Darrell Floyd. He's the Chief Operating Officer of Wood-Mizer, LLC. Darrell is the Chief Operating Officer of Wood-Mizer, based in Indianapolis. He received his MBA from Taylor and began his career as an IT technician for Wood-Mizer. And he has more full details on his bio in the program guide. Then next to him is Ben Ovenden. He's the sales manager for Thomas Medical. Ben is the sales manager and has part of Indianapolis-based medical manufacturer Thomas Medical. During his tenure, export revenues have grown 44%, and he now says that exports account for over 25% of all revenue. That's quite a number, and I'm sure the company is very happy to hear that. Details in the pamphlet. Last but not least is my friend and colleague Oleg Gostomelsky. Oleg is the Managing Director of European Operations for Telamon Corporation, where he recently licensed Telamon Europe subsidiary in Macedonia. Prior to joining Telamon, he was part and vice president of Hoosier Gasket Corporation, HGC, where he designed their European business development program. So he has a wealth of knowledge and experience, all our panelists do, on doing business in Europe. And so to start our discussion this afternoon, we'd like to ask our panelists to discuss, just for a few minutes, their own personal business situation and give an overview of their company. We're going to start, Oleg, on the far end down there, to ask you to give an overview of your company, firm, and your business. This might be a chance for you to also discuss a few things about your operations in Europe. Oleg, please.
Thank you. Telamon Corporation is headquartered in Carmel, Indiana, just north of Indianapolis. And basically, we have two major divisions, telecommunications and industrial solutions. The industrial solutions division, of which I'm a part, has been requested by our customers to create an operations base in Europe, and we have done so, or in the process of doing so, I should say. And we have chosen Macedonia after some research. We have recently leased a facility, hired our first group of managers on the ground, and also went through a process of licensing the business, as Mark mentioned earlier, as well as all the other associated details with launching a business in a new country. Our intent, of course, is to supply our existing customers who have European locations who prefer to be supplied in Europe. And we also have a more long-term intent of obviously getting new customers now that we have a production operation in the continent, which obviously reduces a great deal of transportation costs and lead time requirement to supply the products other than doing it from North America.
Oh, great. So I'm the general manager for Thomas Medical. We're a local manufacturer of medical devices, primarily serving women's health, obstetrics, gynecology, fertility products. Our products are primarily sterile, single-use products. In the U.S., we're in about 1,500 facilities, and overseas we're in about 40 countries, 9 countries in Europe. As Mark indicated, our international presence has grown over the last couple of years, and right now about 9% of our revenue is going to Europe. Our European revenue, there's a mix of, we sell under our own brand, we also private label for some of our distributors, and we also manufacture unique products for some European-based distributors.
Hi, I'm with Wood-Mizer, and we're a manufacturer on the west side of Indianapolis here. Been in business since 1982, and we've had a presence in a factory in Europe since 1990. That factory is in Koło in Poland, and has been really a great asset for our company. I'd say about 40% of our products that we produce are made in Poland and distributed throughout Europe and into Africa, Asia, U.S., and South America as well. So we've got about 800 employees right now, and I'd say about 40% of those employees are based in Poland. So Wood-Mizer, overall, we're in the wood industry, as you might imagine. We sell products to break down logs into boards, and have just recently expanded into firewood splitting and the breakdown and dismantling of pallets to recycle those, and also into molding, so secondary processing of wood. So the company's growing, doing well. We're happy to be here in Indianapolis, and we've got several branches throughout the world. And I'm not an expert in European business, but I've been there many times, and we do business with them from a U.S. perspective, as well as I obviously have a lot of colleagues over there.
Hi, I'm David Russell. I have a law firm in Carmel, Indiana. I've been doing business on behalf of clients in Europe and throughout the world. Clients here and in Europe, clients in Europe doing business here in the United States for many decades. I have represented primarily manufacturing, technology-based companies, done some work in international privacy law and cyberspace law. A lot of which involves Europe, licensing and that kind of thing. But a great deal of my work has been for European companies and U.S. companies doing business in Europe, has been in establishing distribution arrangements or international sales, and including buying and selling companies. Remember selling a dairy in Spain one time. It's kind of an interesting process. So I've done a lot of work in Europe over the years, and really am encouraged by all the folks here today that are interested in doing business in Europe.
I think we'd like to ask you as panelists to tell us, because obviously our focus is Europe today, what was the impetus for your company? What was the impetus for you as individuals at the company to do business in Europe? There's 170, 180 countries in the world. You could pick any region of the world you wanted to do business. And so there must have been some type of rationale, some type of discussion at the company level that made Europe attractive. And like to know how you chose Europe, and then specifically, Darrell mentioned Poland and Oleg mentioned Macedonia, not one that rolls right off the tongue typically when we're talking about Europe. And Ben, I'm sure there's some interesting markets that you have gone into in the medical device space. Maybe Oleg start, and we'll ask our panelists to just discuss why Europe, and then why a specific country in Europe, and how did you make that choice?
Well, most recently with Telamon Corporation, we chose Europe's choice was kind of driven to us because our customers who were European-based have asked Telamon to have a manufacturing location somewhere in Europe. Once that demand was made, and we realized that business was there, if we were to have a location there, the choice of country was a fairly thorough process. First, we looked at the costs of doing business, both labor costs and, of course, real estate and building costs, infrastructure costs, etc. Second, we looked at the ease of doing business. Now, there's actually a rating for countries and how easy they are to do business in. Macedonia has always been near the top, in the top 5 as far as the easiest countries in which to do business. So that put it into the focus, I would say, initially. But there were other countries who also met that criteria, and we ultimately looked at Slovakia, we looked at Romania, and Macedonia were the 3 finalists. And ultimately, the workforce availability, Romania right now, for example, has a very low workforce availability. There's basically no unemployment there at the moment. or very little. And workforce education level also favored Macedonia. And I would say that the criteria that put it over the top was the willingness of Macedonian government or desire of Macedonian government to welcome foreign investment. So in the case of Macedonian government, Macedonia, for those who do not know, is a very small country just north of Greece, just west of Bulgaria, or east of Albania, if you like. It used to be the southern portion of the former Yugoslav Republic, and one of the 6, now 7, with Kosovo become independent countries that Yugoslavia has devolved into. And that location and that government is very aggressively welcoming to the U.S. business. Not just U.S. business, any foreign investment, but U.S. business as well. And they have, quite honestly, done a very good job of selling Macedonia as a good investment location by providing a incentive plan from the government, allowing for tax refunds, the credits issued for workers hired, et cetera, and so forth, which made this a very much more easier business decision to make, because the costs were either less, or the costs that were there were at least partly refunded at the end of each year in operation based on the incentive agreement that they were willing to provide. So that's how we reached the Macedonia decision. It also helped, quite honestly, and we talked about this before the conference, in the United States, in my opinion, we have a great shortcoming, is that we're one of the very few monolingual societies in the world. Nobody here speaks anything but English by and large. We discovered that in Macedonia, almost everyone also speaks English. So it made it easy for us, so we didn't have to learn Macedonian in the process. The fact is that that's not always the case in some of those countries. In Macedonia, that made it easier to communicate, made it easier to conduct business communication. Honestly, I wish that wasn't necessary, because I really think we should speak more foreign languages, but that's my personal view. But that was certainly a criteria in this decision. Now, I'm going to limit it to the most recent decision, because in the past I've done European expansion plans in Russia and Ukraine, where the impetus for the decision was made for other reasons, but this is the most recent one.
Thank you. So for me, we're not manufacturing and producing in Europe. We're sending products to Europe. So the interest from our side was a high concentration of different countries in a relatively small area, and a nice infrastructure to get things in and out, and you have a single currency as well. So those were the key factors for us. The barriers for us were certainly getting the CE mark, and then going to a higher level medical device ISO registration. Interestingly enough, our biggest markets in the EU are Turkey. Biggest market is Turkey in the EU, which was kind of, we didn't realize that was going to be our big market at the time, but it turns out for women's health, it's a great market for us. So it was very interesting. But one market that we thought we would have a lot of success in is France. We thought, it's going to be a great market for us. Nice and easy to get into that market, but it's been a challenge for us of late. So,
what's the challenge?
The challenge in France is they have a preference, now more of a preference for EU-based manufactured medical devices. So that's not necessarily looking for made in the USA anymore. Other countries, they very much value made in the USA, but in Europe, specifically France, they're kind of moving away from that.
So when we got into Europe in Poland, like I said, in 1990, it was a pretty interesting time. My first trip over was '93, and of course Poland's a lot different today. But it was definitely more of a meandering path. We were a small company at that time. Our international presence, I think, was probably Canada, which we just got into a couple years before. So one of our founders, Don Laskowski, he had a Polish background and just happened to go to Poland and for a personal trip, and looked around, met the right guy. They started a partnership, and and it kind of went from there. Today we're in, I think, seven other countries. We have a branch office in Europe, and some of those, Russia, for example, was one where we just could not get into. We couldn't get our products in through a distributor. We tried many different ways. It was just really difficult, and finally just pulled the trigger. Started a company in Moscow, and went through a couple finding the right branch managers, and then finally, landed on the right guy who we have now, and that business has been really up and down. But it basically the only chance we had from our perspective of doing business in Europe, competing with the local companies, was to have a branch office there where we could control pricing and control, tariffs, and not control tariffs, but figure out a way to get product into Russia, creatively at times. But anyway, we have an office in the UK. We just weren't getting enough bang out of the Poland office. Culturally, there were some issues there, so we decided to start an office in the UK. Our most recent branch there was in France, and that was a little rocky getting started, mostly just finding the right person. But our products were pretty revolutionary when they first came out in the 80s and 90s as far as the most efficient way to saw wood. So, when customers started going to trade shows in the U.S. and seeing our product, they were, to answer your question, Mark, they were telling us, "Hey, you got to come over to Europe. You've got to support us here. We're gonna figure out how to get it over there, but you got to sell us parts. You've got to sell blades to us." So ours was nothing like Oleg's, where very strategically made a decision, checked it all out, and probably did the most wise thing you could do right now. For us, it was much more this meandering path of just reacting to the market and trying to make the right contacts, and in some cases trying until we failed. But today we have a really, in my opinion, a really nice operation there in Poland, a really nice factory, and really it's a good country to do business in.
When I started practicing law, I started with a firm called Winston & Strawn up in Chicago. And our largest client was a company called Beatrice Foods. Doesn't really exist anymore, but a fellow there by the name of Bill Carnes was a kind of remarkable guy, a lawyer, never practiced law. And he had taken a $700 million company from Beatrice, Nebraska, with a bunch of dairies, and embarked on a remarkable acquisition binge. And he bought small to medium size manufacturing companies who sold at wholesale. And he built that company from about a $700 million company to about a $15 billion company in 70s dollars in a period of a little over 10 years. And he did it by a combination of stock, but and didn't spend much cash doing it. But the pitch he made to the owners of these manufacturing companies, who tend to be family owned and entrepreneurial, was, hey, you made money for you, now make money for us. You have to stay with us for 5 years. You have to work for us for 5 years. Your compensation is going to be in Beatrice stock, so you've got a payoff and it's an exit for you. It was a marvelous strategy at the time. He didn't really care about rationalizing the business so that Beatrice companies were competing with each other. And what had happened was that companies in the Beatrice family were competing with each other, and nobody cared. It was just as long as they made money, that was fine. Well, being manufacturers, they wound up being exporters because manufacturers export. It's just a fact. You export domestically, that it winds up going overseas, or you export directly. So by the time they were a $15 billion presence in the United States, they were about a $3 or $4 billion presence in Europe, as well as a couple billion in South and Latin America, and making inroads on the Pacific Rim. Well, I was interested in licensing and distribution, so I became the distribution guy for Beatrice and other firm clients in the U.S., but also in Europe. So I started doing business in Europe for these companies, and of course other companies. And when I came down here to practice in Indianapolis, I found I was getting referrals from my former colleagues in Chicago. Hey, we've got clients in Indiana that want to do business overseas, and they're doing business in Europe. Will you help them? So I've maintained an interest in Europe all these years. I've done work on it, but it was because of this one guy who took this dairy company and built it into a conglomerate, which is kind of a model. It bought companies of the type that we have so many of, companies like, you know, of that you see on this panel, that kind of started small and built and went into international markets and made and distributed things. Those are the companies I've represented my entire career, and a lot of them do business in Europe, as you can see from this panel.
Thank you, panelists. It's very insightful to learn how each company looks at it maybe a little differently. Every company's got a little unique situation that impelled them or compelled them to do something globally. But let me ask, and we've talked a little bit about this during our discussions today. We've talked about regulations. We've talked about some of that. And so I think some of our audience might be interested to know about any kind of barriers that you've had to deal with, any kind of regulatory hurdles that have been an issue. Because frankly, at the commerce level, because I'm with the U.S. Department of Commerce, I don't guess I said that for our TV cameras in the back, but some of my clients ask me, and one of the barriers to entry is in fact something that my colleague Ellen House said about the CE mark or data protection or other things. And so I'd like to ask you, any of the panelists, whoever would like to hold forth for a moment, to talk about any kind of regulatory concerns that you had in Europe that impacted your business, and how did you deal with them, and especially the CE mark, and why was it finally worth doing, because there is a cost to regulation. So please.
Really no expert comment on this at all, but we really on a daily basis, for us, when we look at products that we make in the U.S., we decide to resell for someone else, you know, we usually get pretty excited about it. We can sell it just about anywhere in the world, and then we hit Europe, and it's like, okay, we got to stop, go through the whole CE process. Will this work? Make modifications. So again, that's probably no surprise to anybody here, but it is real. It's pretty much every product, unless it's designed in Europe or was designed as a global product, we've got to stop, wait, 2 or 3 months, go through the process. Recently, we went through a process of renaming a lot of our models to be global and or to change some features. And so for us, it's go tell the marketing department, redo engineering, redoes it. It's a short process. For Europe, it's usually, hey, we got to stop, go through that, reapply for CE, and which is, from their perspective, they're used to it, they do it. For us, it's always kind of a pain. The only other thing I would just mention real quick is in Poland in particular, actually very recently, really the government's looking for money, and they've been camped out in our business for several months, looking at every transaction. How can we get more tax money? They've changed some of the, basically giving some money back to the people, lower taxes or child credit, those sort of things, and they're out looking for how can they get money to fund that. So we've had the regulations on the tax side, the transfer pricing side has been just real recently has been pretty extreme, where our CFO over there has had to not play games, but change how we do things, sign contracts, things like that. So anyway, just a little bit of perspective there from Wood-Mizer's standpoint.
Yeah, from my perspective, the CE mark is certainly the biggest challenge. We don't offer all of our products to Europe. We kind of have to look at them product group, product family by product family, and see if the cost of registering for a CE mark is worth it. Sometimes if we're kind of on the fence, we'll ask for purchase commitments from some of our distributors before we do anything. About a year and a half ago, our Emergo EU rep decided they were going to move, so we had to go and update all of our device history records, and it was about 500 or 600 different product labels that needed to be changed, and quite a process to get all that work done. So that's something to consider, is when something happens over in Europe that somebody else decides to do, it may have implications for what you're doing back here in the States. But, at the end of the day, getting a CE mark is an easy decision for most of our products. So they help a lot of people.
I would say that the key to success in overcoming these barriers, and I've encountered them, and they're different for every country. So in Macedonia, there were a certain set of regulatory barriers. In Ukraine, when we opened in my previous job, when we opened the distribution center and warehouse, there was an entirely different set of barriers. And in Russia, when we opened the sales office in St. Petersburg, yet again, a different set of barriers. Generally speaking, and my experience in Europe has been that you need to do your research on the country as much as you can, get local representation, legal and financial, from a trustworthy partner, recommended partner, who can forewarn you of the pitfalls you may encounter unintentionally, and then be very patient, because patience is the key. They're in every European expansion that I have been a part of, and this is in terms of actually putting facilities in the ground, that's 3. I don't know what is going to take 12 to 15 times longer than you think it should take, but I know something will. So when you build your timeline, you make sure, or a project timeline, you make sure that you have reaction time to that something that's going to show up out of left field, completely unexpected, because of some local regulation that's relatively obscure and doesn't really matter until it does. And in Macedonia, as an example, what took an unexpectedly long amount of time was opening a business bank account. Something so routine and so typical in the United States, we don't even think about it. It may take a day, okay, fine, 2 days. Well, in example of Macedonia, they have a very, very strict money laundering law. So in order to open an account for the first time as a foreign entity, there is a very time-consuming and document-intensive bureaucratic process you have to go through to demonstrate the ownership of the parent company, who owns the parent company, who these people are, what their identities are, and to show that they are not, in fact, trying to use the newly established business to launder money. Now, none of this actually presented, obviously, any difficulty, but the actual time required to complete the documents, to have the documents approved, to have the documents agreed to, or by the local bank that's going to be the host of our account, that took several weeks just to get the documents in place to show that the owners of Telamon Corporation aren't trying to use the Telamon European branch to launder money. The law has a lot of teeth, and penalties are all focused on the banks. So the banks, in order to protect themselves, are very, very careful with this process. That's just one example. Earlier in my career, when we opened the office in St. Petersburg, the sales office in St. Petersburg, some of the simple document turnaround times were extremely long by U.S. standards. You would think that a certain document might take 2-3 days to complete. It takes 2-3 weeks, because there are many, many more steps than are advertised. They may say, okay, in order to complete this particular form to register this company, there are 6 requirements you have to meet, and here the 6 requirements are, and they publish it. when you go to requirement number 1, everything's fine. You get to requirement number 2. Well, in order to achieve requirement number 2, there's 5 other requirements to meet to be qualified for number 2, which aren't listed in the original documentation. So you have to dig into the number 2 requirement, find out what those 5 are, achieve them, and some of them have sub-requirements. So by the time you complete the 6, you've actually completed 37 different requirements or some other apparently ridiculous number, but that's what it takes. So you need to make sure that there's a local advisor, and I can tell you we have successfully used the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Department of Commerce commercial branches and the embassies for that aid. They've been able to recommend to us, or at least give us a list of approved legal and financial firms in the local area who are used to and have experience in getting foreign companies registered in the local country. And that allows you to walk you through this process. So with patience is very important, because you can easily get frustrated, especially the fact that you have a lot of deadlines which you set believing that the thing should take as much time as they take in the United States, and not realizing that sometimes they take 10, 12 times longer. So that was a barrier that has come up in every expansion, and one that can be overcome by patience and research and time. Additionally, there are some, when you start dealing, and this is not regulatory so much, but as cultural in essence. When we start dealing with cultural aspects of doing business in Central and Eastern Europe, it may not be so much in Western Europe, or not quite as pronounced, but the business relationships matter a great deal. So in the United States, our economy is very transactional in nature. If I'm selling widgets and you're buying widgets and you like my price and your checks doesn't bounce, we can do business. We don't actually have to meet each other. I'll take your orders online, I'll ship the orders and so forth. In many European cultures, that's just not the way it's done. You don't do business with someone you don't know. You have to get to know someone, you have to establish a business relationship, and actually have a much more relationship-based approach, which takes time to develop. So this, to a lesser degree, this even works in their government circles, because you have a situation where, especially in smaller European countries, which are the size of a typical US state, you essentially have an environment where, it may be a slight exaggeration, but not much I want to say, that everyone knows everyone. So, or at least have heard of someone. So you need to establish a business relationship so that, or a personal relationship, so that business and your regulatory issues can be addressed better because you have that relationship with the person. But it takes time and effort to create that relationship, which is not second nature to most people in the United States. We're very much, here's a goal, here's a deal, let's go do this. And yes, transaction oriented, absolutely. So that's another item that I said experience has taught me, that you have to make time to simply go meet and do a face-to-face meeting and build a relationship with the people you're going to work with. So.
My business is law, and I represent clients who do business in Europe, and I'm licensed to practice law in Indiana and Illinois, and not in Luxembourg and not in Denmark. But I need to be involved many times with their transactions because I understand the client, and I understand the business, I understand the issues, and in many cases I understand the European issues. I remember one time helping a law firm, a lawyer I knew in England, notify an agreement for antitrust purposes to the European Commission. His firm had never done that, but I had, so I had to help him do that. But it was also good to have somebody in the EU who could work cooperatively with the client. So one thing I've done over the years is build a network throughout Europe of lawyers and law firms whom I know personally, because I think Oleg's point is very important. It's very important to have this personal relationship with the people you're doing business with, where there's mutual trust, where you know each other, you've met face to face, you've worked together, you know the capacities of these people and their law firms. So I know lawyers in every European country. I know them personally. I know their families. It's important because when I have a client who has a problem in Europe, I have a network of people that I can call on. If you have an intellectual property problem in Germany, I call Marga, my friend who has her own patent firm, and Marga helps me solve the problem for my client. I've known her for 20 years. I know she's competent, I know she's good, I know she's represented all sorts of major clients from all over the world in Germany, and I know she's one of the top trademark lawyers and patent lawyers in Europe. So that's what I've done to try to be prepared to represent clients in Europe. The other thing that I would mention, and this is a tip that those of you who are doing business in Europe, is one of the barriers is dispute resolution. If you get into a European country, you're always worried, well, I don't have the bargaining power with my partner or with the people I'm doing business with because I'm not from here. I'm going to get hometown. If I have to resolve a dispute in France or Germany, something bad's going to happen to me because I'm not from here. It's not my primary language, maybe. And I'll just give you a kind of a legal tip that I use when I'm drafting agreements that are going to be for my American client and my European client to enter into. I strongly recommend that you have a clause picking international arbitration as a dispute resolution mechanism. That lets you do two things. One is you get to pick a venue which may not be, if you're doing business with a French company, you may not have to pick Paris. You might pick Stockholm or something like that. You could pick a neutral jurisdiction, or New York, as a place to arbitrate. That's somewhat important. It's not crucial. But the thing that is crucial is there's a hierarchy in law. So arbitration in virtually every case as a dispute resolution mechanism is enforceable because of a treaty. That means that if you get a judgment in arbitration, it's very unlikely that a court in the US or a court in Europe will look behind the arbitration proceeding and say, no, we're going to decide it all over again, or we're going to second guess it. Once you have the arbitral award by treaty, you will trump the local authorities in Europe, and they'll go in and they will say, well, here's this judgment by arbitration, we'll enforce it. That's very important because if you just get a judgment, whether you get a judgment in the US and you take it to France to enforce it, or you get a judgment in France and you take it to the US to enforce it, or you try to enforce it there will be principles of law, they're called comity principles, that basically say, well, we're going to try to engage in some sort of intellectual sophistry and say, well, if the roles were reversed, could we take that judgment and enforce it if the shoe were on the other foot? And that's a hypothetical exercise. Nobody knows how comedy will come out. It's one of these things in the law books. They give three possible answers to every comedy problem, and all of them are correct. But with the treaty trumps law, treaty trumps court, treaty will help you. So think about when you're negotiating, whatever your agreement says, think about making it enforceable via some sort of international arbitration, and think about that as giving you at least a level playing field if in the unfortunate event you disagree with something with the person you're buying from, selling from, distributing through or whatever. So that's sort of a practical thing that I recommend to people to level the playing field to avoid the barrier, I guess, Mark, of being hometowned in Italy.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I've also instructed my clients through the years to consider arbitration as opposed to going to court, legal proceedings directly, because as David can attest, and I'm sure knows much more than I do, taking someone to court in a specific country can be difficult at best. I want to move on a little bit to keep our discussion going and talk a little bit about distribution. For many of our clients, and we'll allow you to have some latitude here because I remember Tom Miller's points today about having a facility in country. You know, you have different levels of engagement in a foreign market where you might want to have a distribution agreement, you might want to have just a branch, you might want to have a corporation. And I'm curious, because we have various instances of different levels of just those examples on this panel. How did you choose your distributor if you had one? And then if you decided to go further, like in Poland, in that case, you know, what is the fine line that makes the distinction where we say, I'm not going to have a distributor, but now I'm going to have a facility or a factory or whatever, because the commitment level is higher. So I'd like to start with our panelists that talk about distribution. Let's start there first and say, how do you choose your distributor? Are there any red flags or things that you take note of when you're trying to choose them? And do you have any strategies? And perhaps Ben, maybe you can start us with that because you have some experience there, and please share some of your experience.
To plug the U.S. Commercial Service a little bit, they have a great gold key matching service where for a nominal fee, they'll go out and identify a handful of distributors that would be potentially good fits to distribute your products. If I've identified a country and I don't know who I want to sell my products, then that's the route that I would go. And from there, you could set up meetings and progress. Several of our distributors have attended U.S. trade shows where we've been exhibitors and have identified that they'd be interested in selling our products in those countries, in their country. So that's been another resource. Certainly one thing that I continue to do, and I'll be doing in July, is I'll fly over for a European trade show for a product that for our market, not necessarily to exhibit, but to visit booths, meet with potential distributors, and find business that way. It's a relatively low investment. There's usually grant opportunities for those, those are some things that I do to identify a distributor. Usually in the med device space, it takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months to figure out if they're going to be a good distributor for you or not. They may place a large initial order and you think things are going to be great, and then all of a sudden they can't sell product. So it's important to get payment up front for the first few orders. But yeah, I usually give distributors leeway for 12 to 18 months, non-exclusive agreements, non-exclusive territories, things of that nature. They show some interest in commitment by buying samples to give to their customers. That tells me that they're interested in our company and our products and what we offer. But yeah, for me, there's three primary ways for finding new distributors. Going over there, them coming here, and using the U.S. Commercial Service.
Do you how do you qualify, Ben, those distributors? I mean, a guy comes up to you at a trade show, and says, I want to be your distributor. I'm fantastic.
Right.
What do you do then?
90% of the time, they're probably a good talker, but they don't have they're not that great at selling products long term. So what we normally do, if it's a country that we're not in, is I'll say okay, let's talk, and we may give them a non-exclusive 1-year agreement where we'll agree to not find a new distributor and go exclusive with them for a product or products during that same time. They give us a purchase commitment upfront, prepay for that. They can sell and market our products in that area for a year, and we kind of go from there. We give them as much marketing support as we can, but it really is. And to what Oleg and David said, you have to have face time with them first. That's very important, establishing relationships. I generally know within a few weeks of discussions if things are going to work out or not. If they're not replying to emails or returning calls, things like that, if you can't get a hold of them, then they're either too busy or they don't care. And both of those things are problematic.
Any other panelists want to comment just on distribution? I don't know if Oleg or Darrell has any other comments there.
Yeah, I have to say that Ben has much more extensive experience in distribution than I do, because most of our customers are large OEM type manufacturers. So there's not a question of distributing the product to an individual consumer or getting the product to individual consumers' hands, or even a multitude of small businesses. When we go into a country, we really know if there are potential customers in there, and it's usually just a handful, because usually major customers and major manufacturers, and in those cases, the products we provide are specifically designed, customer designed for a particular application. So it's not a case where that same product can be sold to other companies other than the ones for which it was designed. So we're not really dealing with distributors, other than occasionally our customers serve as our distribution warehouses and hold inventory for us in that regard. But that's a different animal than the one that Ben was addressing. So I guess his experience would be wider by far than mine in this area. Other than I'll agree with him that, yeah, again, personal relationships, cultural similarities or differences transcend specifics of the business. You still need to do those regardless of how you approach the actual business model.
Go ahead, Darrell, if you have a comment, sure.
Yeah, just a quick comment on Mark, on your question about when do we know when to have a branch office, when do we have distributors. There's obviously a lot of factors. One, just a financial metric we usually look at is if we think a market's worth a couple $1 million, then we are seriously thinking about a branch office. So that, sometimes we're looking, well, we're not making any progress with our distributor, but what's the market really worth? In some cases, like in France, we tried, several distributors. We couldn't get it to work. We were pretty sure the market was 2 million or more, so we, hey, we're going to put an office in there. So it's worked pretty well for us. Actually, we've just in probably the last 5 to 7 years is when most of our branch offices have come about, and really that was from a growth strategy. We are going to grow in Europe, for example, and this area isn't doing well, so we're going to go put a branch office in. We do go back. Our distributor process would be very similar to Ben's. We do go out usually just to customers. After 30 years, we've got customers in just about every country. So we just go start talking to customers. Who do you know? Where do you buy other woodworking type product from? Do you know, where do you buy trailers from? Where do you buy tractors from? Anything like that, we start asking, because usually these customers trust us and like us, so we go about that path. So that's helped us find some distributors as well.
Okay. David, why don't you talk to us about some tips for distribution? You have a lot of experience in distribution contracts. I know you've spoken on that quite a bit. Would you like to give us some commentary on distribution agreements and structuring those agreements, and help perhaps our audience and for those that need to know more about what makes a good distribution agreement?
Basically, the decision you make when you decide to distribute is very much what Darrell has been talking about. You start selling, you get known in the market, you have longtime customers that you deal with, and so that's a process of selling the product in the market and getting paid. And at some point, if you don't open an office, you say, well, I'd like somebody to help me there, and I'd like an agent or a distributor to help me. And so the first question that you might be thinking about is, well, what's the difference between an agent and a distributor? And the first level of answer is, well, distributors are a kind of agent, but under the law they're somewhat they're treated somewhat differently. So what is the difference between an agent and a distributor? And the only answer that I can give you that I think will really work is the distributor assumes the risk of non-payment for the goods, whereas the agent does not. The agent arranges the sale, he gets paid from the proceeds of the sale. So that's the difference. Legally, the agent is protected by one set of laws that are very favorable to agents, and it's very hard sometimes to get rid of an agent if you aren't careful. And even if you are careful, there are a lot of laws protecting agents, and there are a lot of laws in countries in Europe protecting distributors. Once you get somebody, you can terminate them, but they may be entitled to some sort of tail on the relationship where they get paid for vacations, they get paid they get paid a residual depending on how long the customers have done business with them, what their volume has been, and so forth. So even with your best efforts to go in wisely to these arrangements, you may run into some local protectionist type laws. We have them here in the US, so you may have run into them here. There's specific industries that get dealer protection laws. There's something called the Automobile Dealers Day in Court Act in federal law that protects automobile dealerships from getting arbitrarily terminated. So Europe isn't unique in that, but you need to be kind of aware that that environment is out there when you put these arrangements together, whether it be a distributorship or an agency. The thing with a distributorship that is different legally in Europe is that Europe has antitrust laws, which basically prohibit agreements or combinations that could restrain trade. Well, every agreement restrains trade because you say, I'll do business with you, but not with your buddy. So there's a restraint of trade there. And because unlike the US, Europe looks at arrangements between competitors and potential competitors and arrangements between suppliers and resellers as equally bad restraints of trade. You need to worry about those kinds of arrangements a little bit. But unless you are a very large presence in the Europe market, there has been since 2010 what they call a block group exemption, which says that if you don't have over 30% of the market in a given market segment, and I could get technical as what's the market segment, you probably are not going to have a major antitrust problem. If you have a major antitrust problem, the procedure under the Treaty of Rome, which is where the antitrust laws would be you would have to notify the agreement and say, European Commission, I'm going to have this kind of distribution arrangement. could I do it given that it's got these kinds of provisions in it, and I'm over 30% of the market, but or whatever. And usually, if it's not a major problem, you could get it cleared, but it's some red tape. You won't have to do that if you fall, and most of your companies will fall within the block group exemptions. So what I'll talk about now are just some practical tips about things that you could do, you could have in your agreements that would pass muster in Europe in specific, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. You could put them in, and there are restrictions on what your distributor can do, that you could just negotiate that with your distributor. One tip that I have that I think might surprise some people, I personally recommend to my client that they never use the word exclusive when they're granting rights to a distributor. It doesn't mean that you can't tell a distributor, I won't appoint anyone else in the territory if you meet these goals, that I won't sell myself into the territory as long as you're selling for me. You can say all the things that go into what makes an exclusive agreement, but the problem is that nobody knows exactly what exclusive means. It doesn't mean, because there's a double foreclosure basically. Basically, you're saying to the person you're granting the rights, this is what you're getting, but you're also saying, and this is what I'm telling you I won't do. Rather than try to leave that to just guesswork as to what it means or let the courts decide what it means, just tell them, you can sell to these customers, and I won't sell to them direct, and I won't authorize anyone else to sell direct, but I won't prevent somebody else from Canada or something selling into your territory because I can't. That's this kind of thing. Just be very, very specific. Don't use the word exclusive, because exclusive is something somebody can sue you on, and you will wind up arguing about what exclusive means, and you will find out when you read the cases and you see what courts decide that exclusive means whoever won the case said it meant. And that's not a good position to be in. So that's just sort of a practical tip. Just break down all the things that you will do and all the things you won't do and all of the things they will do. Now, as a way to add teeth to some of these agreements, set sales goals. You can do that. You can tell them, I want you to sell this much. This is the problem that Darrell was just talking about. They have somebody, he's not really developing the territory. You've got him there. He's not developing the territory. Well, Darrell's solution is, well, I'll just go in and open an office. But if you have an exclusive agreement, you might get sued, because he'd say, well, you gave me an exclusive. You can't terminate me, or you can't terminate me without giving me a big payoff. Or you've given me an exclusive, and actually I'm representing your biggest competitor. Wood-Mizer doesn't have any competitors, but if they did, they could be just trying to keep Darrell's company out so that they could hog the market for the other company they represent. So don't give them an exclusive, and try to be very specific about what they're supposed to do to keep their rights. It's not going to stop you from being subject to these laws, but it doesn't hurt to say, yeah, I want you to sell a lot, and then that's typically what happens. I think it was Ben that said, maybe you get a big order and then you don't get another one for a while. That's pretty common. People take a big order and then they don't buy anything for 3 years. You need to set sales goals and say, well, you'll sell 110% in the second year and 120% in the third year, you need to give them incentive to keep developing the market. Otherwise, they'll just place one order and then they'll tie up the market until they sell off the inventory. So you can set sales goals, and then another thing you can do is you can specify the terms of sale, and that's, you say, well, we'll just use Incoterms or whatever, but there's some nuances from a legal standpoint. When we sell something under the laws of Indiana, we sell under what's called the Uniform Commercial Code. But when we sell to somebody in Germany under the laws of Indiana, by treaty, remember, treaty trumps law, by treaty, the laws, the United Nations Convention on contracts for the international sales of goods. Well, what difference does that make? That doesn't make any difference. Well, Indiana law, the UCC, is pro-buyer. It's easy to get into a contract. It's easy to get out of a contract. It's pro-buyer. You're actually better off with Indiana law being the convention, United Nations Convention, because that's pro-seller. You don't have a contract unless it's agreement on all material terms and that kind of thing. So when you're selling to your distributor, and a sale to a distributor is a sale, because the distributor is then assuming the risk, remember, of not getting paid on resales, and he's buying this from you. So you want to sell him under the United Nations Convention, I would advise. You may not, but that would be a nuance that just saying Indiana law applies. Indiana law applies means one thing when you're selling to somebody in Indiana and another thing when you're selling to somebody in Europe. So that's a good idea. Some folks have mentioned, that I think Mark mentioned patent rights and so forth. You need to be careful that whatever rights you need to protect, if you haven't protected your patent rights, you need to realize that your technology is not patented and what that means, because it's probably too late by the time you're selling to do anything about that. But you may have some confidential information, both regarding your customers and suppliers and ways of doing business and so forth, and your technology, that you might want to tie up with enforceable arrangements to keep that secret. And then you might want to be able to have clauses in there that prevent your distributor from going out and trademarking your trademark and patenting your secret information. And you also may want to think with your distributor about, if you get sued for infringing somebody else's intellectual property, what are our duties? Do I have to keep selling to you? And if I have to keep selling to you, does that mean I have to get involved in intellectual property litigation in a foreign jurisdiction? Or can I walk away and you walk away? That kind of thing you could think a little bit about. What happens if there's something goes wrong with the machine or whatever you're selling? So who's responsible for warranty? How much support are you going to give your distributor? And so on. You can have all of that sort of thing. And then to what extent, and I'll defer to our tax gurus here, but to what extent can you shift local tax compliance on these purchases and resales, VAT and so forth? To what extent can you make sure that when you sell something for whatever terms you're selling to your distributor, that you get the whole price instead of some discounted price based on the fact, well, I had to pay taxes on this, and the government had to withhold a bunch of stuff, so I thought I was selling it to you for 100%, but you're really only going to get 70%, and the rest is going to the government. Well, you need to talk with Tom Miller to figure out whether you can do that in that jurisdiction, and then you need to negotiate with your distributor to do that. So, and then to the extent you can, figure out what kinds of termination are allowed under the laws of the jurisdiction, and I think that's a good idea. And then try to tailor your own termination provisions in your agreement to whatever decompression terms, and there will be some, like in Belgium, there will be some terms based on how long you've had a relationship with your distributor or your agent. There'll be some rules about how that's supposed to work. Try to make sure that yours work that way. Try to make sure that you are not going to be looked on as somebody violating European law, because one thing you don't want is your termination provision to be void, and then it's up to whoever's deciding your dispute whether they should just throw the book at you and give you a lot of damages. So to your distributor. So those are just some practical ideas that you could be thinking about. To the extent that you can, tailor your distribution arrangement in Europe to the kinds of things that you do when you distribute in the United States. Your people are already used to how to do that. Just, if you need to rethink how you're doing these things in the United States, this is a good chance to do that too. Look at your own distribution arrangements and realize that it isn't that different in Europe, but you've got some additional problems. So I hope I didn't go on too long there, Mike.
No, thank you. I think the point, and thank you, David, for your comments. It's important because just like in anything in agreements, everything is great until it isn't. Everything with the agreement is great until there's a problem, and everything is fantastic with the distributor until it isn't. And then all the things that David mentioned that may seem esoteric on their face, they become real things when you actually have to deal with them. So we appreciate those comments, and it'll help us be wiser when we structure these agreements. As we start to come around the bend, the last question for our panelists, and we appreciate you're all being here today, we'd like you to do a little bit of crystal ball searching here, a little forecasting, and try to look at your business and perhaps see what do you see in Europe in the future from your business. We've seen some of the commentary earlier in the day about Europe itself writ large, but we'd like to see from your business perspective, where do you see Europe going and how do you see it impacting your business? Do some of the things that are happening in the news right now, whether they are Brexit, we talked about that, or some of the tariff issues or other things that you'd like to discuss, how do you see the future of your business being impacted and going forward for the future? And we'll start with you, Oleg, down there on the end to sort of wrap your comments up there.
Sure. Thank you. Overall, I think that you can divide Europe, in my opinion, in two areas. Obviously, the EU, European Union countries, and those that are not EU. Now, the EU business, even though there is Brexit on the horizon, the EU area is still in the process of growth. The latest, I believe, there's 5 candidate countries that are looking for ascension into the EU, undergoing the EU process over the next several years, and I think the decision will be reached, I heard most recently, by 2020 about their futures. But one of those countries is Turkey. I think they're in that group. There's a lot of the countries in the Balkans that are trying to expand. So even the Brexit notwithstanding, the EU as a trade pact will grow over the years. So dealing with the EU, if your business is within the companies in EU, is going to give you basically a broader alliance of countries through which you can move your goods with minimal, once you're in the market, with minimal restriction, with minimal border controls and minimal stoppages of those points, and using one currency, as was brought up by someone earlier. If you're dealing with countries outside EU, you need to look at them on a case-by-case basis. However, we've all, I think, heard the expression BRIC for emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China. Well, obviously, Russia is a huge factor in Europe. It's not a member of the EU, of course, but nevertheless, it's just by virtue of its sheer size, its sheer population, we're making it the largest country in Europe, even though it's not entirely in Europe, of course. In fact, 70% of it's in Asia, but the 30% that's in Europe is the core of both the industrial development and the population base. So it's the largest country in Europe population in that, by that standard, and also the fact that it has the enormous raw resources that oil, gas, etc., that have impact on the world at large, not just Europe, but Europe most immediately. So I think that that market opportunity will also be, if not growing, certainly be stable and available for use, with the caveat that it is going to fluctuate based on the energy prices, because I've heard it once described as economically speaking, it's a gas station with a flag on it. That may not be accurate, but it drives, as a description, but it drives a point home that they're very much reliant upon raw materials. So I think in EU, you have a continually to grow market. Outside of EU, you have Russia as an individually large economic player that will at least stay stable in a sense of size, but may fluctuate based on the energy prices as they go. And then, of course, if Britain does in fact exit EU, the United Kingdom exit EU, then once it does, it'll be another standalone large economic player in the market. However, having operated in Europe for well over a decade, largely in non-EU countries as far as putting in facilities, but selling, of course, into EU countries, I can say that overall the European market is not going to go anywhere. It's going to actually, I think, grow because population overall is growing, and the economies of the major players are already very well developed, and those of the minor players are only improving. So those countries in Europe that are not economically as strong as the Germanys, the France, the Italys, and of the world, those countries, those that aspire to join EU, will actually elevate their economic systems in order to meet the EU requirements. And those that are having difficulty right now, I think eventually will get through the problems they have and continue to improve. So overall, strategically speaking, I think the prospect in Europe for business is very good. I think that obviously that's strategically speaking. If you look at strategy, the stock market always goes up, but in the middle you have the fluctuation. So there may be up and downs in a general upslope. But overall, I think for the business is positive. And for our business, as in Telamon Corporation and the products we supply to Europe, that market in size for us is almost exactly the same as the market for NAFTA countries. So while we are a major player in NAFTA, we're currently not yet a major player in Europe, so we have lots of room to grow because we feel we can have the same market share in Europe in about a decade that we now enjoy in North America.
Ben?
Yeah, so to echo Oleg's statements, we also feel that Europe's going to be a major player for many years to come. The medical device healthcare market in Europe is strong, it's stable, it's growing every year. Our primary focus is on women's health and fertility and things like that, social healthcare insurance, social insurance in Europe is beginning to recognize more of a need for paying for infertility treatments. So that's a big boon for us and for what we do specifically. Overall, Europe is a large focus of ours. We're also looking at Singapore as a medical device hub. We do very well in the Middle East. So there's other areas that we're looking at, but certainly Europe is a big player for us. We're mostly in Western Europe and are looking to get into Eastern Europe quite a bit more.
Darrell, any comments?
Yeah, really just the same. We feel very bullish about Europe and the potential there. Actually, for us, our strategy really is just to bring in new products and to get into new market segments that surrounding the wood industry. But this year is definitely an uptick for us in Europe, And with our expanded branch offices, as I've mentioned a couple of times, I think that's a area where we have full control and we can really push through. So yeah, I mean, Europe, there's struggles here and there. Russia's one that for sure has impacted our business. I think behind Canada, it was probably our second biggest branch office a couple of years ago, and it's been a struggle here in the last couple of years with turmoil and tariffs and I mean, that's on the political side, but really a lot of competition within Russia as well on products that are similar to ours or better than ours or better marketed than ours. So Russia's a challenge. We hope to turn that around for sure, but in Europe in general, feeling really good about that and what we can do there.
Thank you. David, any closing comments about Europe?
I think that if you look at sort of the political landscape right now with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty dead or in jeopardy, China markets increasingly closing to U.S. investment and imports, and you look at the world and then you look at Europe, I can't help but agree with my panel here that prospects for selling, sourcing in Europe are very, very strong. Branding with European logos and in the U.S. and overseas, trade and services. There's just bright prospects for Europe, and I think as Europe is fragmenting to some extent in terms of Brexit, there'll be even more opportunities. I would view it as, oh, now we have two markets instead of just one. So there's opportunity. Yeah, there's chaos, but I would say there's also great wealth and great prospects. So I feel very bullish, as do the other panelists, on, Darrell was saying, he feels very bullish on Europe. I think that Europe is going to be a really bright economic prospect for U.S. exporters in the decade to come.
Thank you, David. And I want to say thank you so much to our panelists today for being a part of an interesting discussion on doing business in Europe. And I also want to say thank you to the Kelley School and the folks at CIBER for allowing us to be a part of this today. I'm Mark Cooper. I'm the director of the U.S. Department of Commerce office here in Indiana. Our job is to help Indiana companies export. I believe we can compete and win in the global economy, and we want to thank you for being with us today and being a part of this discussion. We've enjoyed it.